Most people want a clean, fair and sustainable world, and it is frustrating that's not happening sooner. Political indifference or vested interests do contribute to this, but there's also a host of technical problems that have to be solved before we can reach this green future. We can't overhaul the entire world without overcoming some obstacles along the way. My name is Cormac O'Malley. I'm an electrical engineering PhD student with a research focus on low carbon power system operation. And I want to delve into these problems with you and hear from experts about the solutions that research can offer.
From the Integrated Development of Low Carbon Energy Systems programme at Imperial College London, this is Low Carbon Conversations, a podcast on the challenges of building a decarbonised energy system and the research that's helping us to overcome them. This podcast is supported by Energy Futures Lab, Imperial's Energy Institute. For more information, visit imperial.ac.uk/Energy Futures Lab.
Around the world, electrification is being banked on as the main method to decarbonise road transport. But in many places, uptake has lagged behind ambition. In the UK, for example, the sale of new petrol and diesel cars will be illegal by 2030. But currently, only 6.6% of new cars are electric vehicles, or EVs for short. So what are the main barriers slowing the uptake of EVs? And how can we overcome them? Should we even be trying to replace old cars with EVs? Or will car sharing, advanced ride-hailing apps, autonomous vehicles and micromobility make the idea of private car ownership a thing of the past? In this episode, I speak to Dr Aruna Sivakumar about the future of road transport. She is a senior lecturer in travel behaviour and urban system modelling at the Centre for Transport Studies, Imperial College London, and the director of the Urban Systems Lab. She leads several high-profile smart city and systems modelling initiatives for a range of funding bodies, including the EPSRC, the Wellcome Trust, and the EU Horizon 2020 programme. I found her human-centric views about how to best decarbonise our transport insightful and refreshing, as too often engineers work in ideal worlds where humans always act as predicted. I began our conversation by asking her to outline the scale of the problem we face in decarbonising road transport.
To begin with, when you say road transport, and we're obviously excluding all the non-road aspects of transport, which are a much larger problem as well, but to focus on road transport, it encompasses a very large number of different kinds of fleets, each with their own different decarbonisation challenges. The challenge with phasing out the internal combustion engine vehicle is, for example, EV uptake. If we assume that electrification is the primary solution, which is by no means a given, there are strong proponents against and for electric vehicles, and I'm no expert on that in particular. So if we assume for a minute that we're focusing even on electrification as one of the potential solutions, then the question of EV uptake is itself a challenge. Are the costs of an electric car attractive to the consumer? Can the charging infrastructure overcome their range anxiety? These are all different market mechanisms to establish over a short time frame. And hence there is usually a need for regulation. And hence things like the UK ban on petrol and diesel cars from 2030, for example. But there are also other aspects of the transport system. What we're talking about, what I mentioned so far in terms of EV uptake, was narrowly focused on consumers' private electric cars. But there's also bus fleets. Is there sufficient charging infrastructure for bus fleets and in the right locations so that bus routes can run without disruption? How can you incentivize public and private fleets? Vehicle to grid is one of the solutions that comes to mind, but we can talk more about that later.
Vehicle to grid, or V2G, is a type of charger for electric vehicles. Not only can power be drawn from the grid into the vehicle to charge and therefore give the vehicle range, but power can actually be taken from the vehicle and pushed back into the grid. This turns a parked car into a grid battery, which has many uses in our future system, some of which we'll talk about later.
freight vehicles. They range from heavy-duty vehicles to urban light-duty vehicles. E-cargo bikes are one of the smaller solutions. Interestingly, emergency vehicles. It's something we don't think about, but they're large fleets as well. We're in fact looking at a proposal right now for the London Fire Brigade. You might like this. And I never realized the challenges involved if we wanted to consider decarbonising the fire brigade's fleet. Because it's not just the challenge of decarbonising a heavy-duty vehicle, a really heavy-duty vehicle, but the fuel in the vehicle is used to run other heavy equipment and machinery. The fire and rescue vehicle can go from one call out, which they seem to call a shout, to another in quick succession with no notice at all. And how does an electric heavy-duty vehicle deal with the charging needs of such a situation? So the challenges, broadly, I would say, are on the transport technology and the various uses that the transport technology is put to, the charging infrastructure, the capacity of the grid, and so on, but also the people, the behaviour, the way they use these vehicles, and what the vehicle means to them, and so on. So there's a lot to be addressed, as you can see.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's interesting that right from the get-go, you sort of draw this distinction between the individual EV and fleets. Why is that really important to think about? Is it that they're just large consumers of new cars, or does the fleet setup, does that offer some actual sort of advantages when it comes to decarbonising them?
Yeah, I think that there are multiple reasons why fleets are different from private vehicles. A good number of them are to do with the fact that the private vehicle is an individual or a household decision versus the fleet is a decision of an entity, a public or private organization. That is a good part of the reason, of course, at the bottom of it all. But the practical implications of that is that fleets have greater incentives sometimes. They have the capital and the resources available to make bigger changes and also see the immediate effects of those changes. For instance, we've looked at multiple little projects, a project that we've worked on for the Royal Borough of Greenwich and their fleet. Another project where we looked at, on behalf of Hitachi, we're looking at Royal Mail fleets and Uber fleets and so on. And all of these fleets, they're really interested to see how electric vehicles can make a change in terms of their actual costs involved, but also the extent to which they can invest in vehicle-to-grid chargers so that they're not just drawing down from the grid, but also being paid to put electricity back into the grid where necessary and where required and so on. So the whole vehicle-to-grid of E2G, for instance, is clearly much more attractive for somebody who's dealing with a fleet than a single car, because there is economies of scale involved.
That's really interesting. And I think we're going to dig down slightly deeper on vehicle to grid a little bit later on in the conversation. But when I was doing my research, I read that 60% of transport emissions from the road are from passenger cars. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to sort of segue into maybe talking about them. I also think, in terms of a listener's experience, they tend to experience transport very commonly through passenger cars and certainly from ownership. Very few people own fire engines. Well, I guess the important thing is, we know that the EV ownership and sales is relatively low in the UK. I think I read something that was around 5% as well of new cars are EVs. I guess the important thing from a decarbonisation point of view is we're trying to grow that. Mm-hmm. And to grow that, we obviously need to convince people to buy the new electric cars. Yeah. And clearly that's not happening. Is that something purely to do with the fact they're more expensive? Are they more expensive? Or are there really other aspects that we need to think about?
I think the personal car, or the private vehicle, is as an interesting problem in and of itself. And the fact that we're trying to basically turn over the entire fleet to electric is a challenge because of what the personal car means to people to some extent. So the car, where people rely on a car, and most people in dense urban areas have a car only if they to some extent rely on it, because the costs of owning one don't quite make sense otherwise. And I'll talk about non-urban areas almost separately, but the car and the fact that it's used for different purposes. I'll take an almost anecdotal example. If you have a home with 2 children, school-age children, and you use the car to drop children off to various activities all weekend long, and you never know when you need to go pick up the child from school, which is not exactly close to home necessarily, especially if you happen to be working further away, if you need to pick up the child sort of on short notice, there is this concern, I guess, to some extent, of will the car be charged and ready for me to go if I suddenly need it? What if my kid's gone for a sleepover and I need to pick the child up when the car's actually charging overnight? What if I have 3 kids that are going to be dropped off in 3 different locations that are not really nearby, none of them have charging available, and I'm stranded, and who's going to go pick up my child? So there's all of these, what we think of as range anxiety is not just about how far can the car go, but what do I need to use the car for, and can I rely on the car to be there for me when I need it? So I think there's this uncertainty to some extent, and it's a technology-related uncertainty, not knowing entirely what this will mean, that comes into the picture.
I completely agree. So perhaps we're in a good spot to try and alleviate some of that anxiety by maybe explaining some of the salient differences between an EV and a fossil fuel car. When I go into the EV sales room and I'm looking at my EV, what are the specs I'm going to be presented with, and what do they mean? What is the battery size on the EV? Mm-hmm. What is its charging rate? Things like that. How should a user be thinking about this, and to try and understand their EV usage?
I think the key aspects, of course, are what's the capacity of the battery and how quickly it charges. And what does the capacity of the battery mean in terms of how much the capacity of the battery is not itself sufficient, obviously, because it depends on the type of vehicle it is. If you have a small vehicle with a large battery capacity, it can take you longer than much further than if you had a very large vehicle with a large boot space and so on, trunk space and so on, with the same battery capacity. That's not going to take you as far, depending on how you drive. So these are the things that I think to some extent we've reached a stage when people understand that the size of the vehicle, the size of the battery, and the speed of charging all matter. The bit perhaps that they're the most uncertain about is that range with this vehicle size and with this battery capacity, is that range going to certainly take me 75 miles? Under what conditions will it be worse? Will it tell me when it's likely to be worse? So I think what would help them is if that range was had a certain uncertainty band around it. If you drive on a rainy day, start and stop at a certain speed, how does it matter for how far it will get you? Knowing that, for instance, battery, it's not just about how quickly it charges, but will it then deteriorate over time? How quickly will it deteriorate over time? Will it stop charging as fast? Will it stop holding as much charge? I think these are questions that they don't necessarily hear the answers to right now, but perhaps would want to hear about when they're considering buying an electric car. And the other thing I'll tell you, this is more not from trying to sell somebody a car, but more from the experience of working with collecting data from people and trying to understand whether they would buy a car. We find that there is a difference between giving somebody information. So we gave our survey respondents documents that summarized a lot of this information for the electric car, and we did these hypothetical studies of whether they would purchase a car with a certain set of attributes, vehicle size, battery capacity, in other words, range, price, and charging time, and so on. And then we did the same thing, but in a separate study, we gave the people involved a car, an electric car, for 2 days. It was meant to be longer, but unfortunately the funding didn't let us do it for longer. But we gave it to them for 2 days to use and recharge. And there was a difference in terms of how sensitive these people were to range compared to people who'd been just given that information. So I think to some extent, it's about being familiar with what is involved in using a car that has a different set of parameters compared to the petrol or diesel engine vehicle. Wanting to get familiar with that before they have to invest the money in it.
Just to clarify, the people who did get the chance to use the EV they were much more positive about buying it in the
Right.
subsequent tests. Yes.
They were much less concerned about range is more the way I would put it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think for me it seems like the EV was, the car, when manufacturing was really taking off last century, was pitched as, you have a car, you have this freedom to go anywhere you want. And I guess the problem is with electric cars, I mean, you still do with fast chargers, but it is slightly restricted. You have to really think. You can't just go fill up petrol, go. You have to think about, is there a charger? How long am I going to be charging for?
Yeah.
And so maybe, the whole idea of the car, I'm thinking of someone driving across the Midwest in America, down a highway, is this idea of freedom. And certainly for older generations, I'm sure it must be quite hard to then go towards these EVs, which are restricted.
Absolutely. Unless it's not your own private vehicle and you can just go down the street and pick up whichever car is charged and ready to go whenever you need it. And this is sort of entering to the space of shared vehicles. I don't know if you want to start talking about that right away, but if you had a shared vehicle, perhaps that actually alleviates some of these issues. I don't know. Or perhaps it worsens it, and that's partly what we're researching.
Yeah. I do want to talk about that, but not without dropping in my own anecdotal story. My parents recently bought a electric car. I think the idea of a range or an uncertainty range around the given range is brilliant, because my parents are terrified of turning on the heating or air conditioning because it seems to take about 20 miles off the counter, and so they no longer drive it really anywhere other than the shops. So I think what you're saying, just to sort of back it up with an anecdotal experience from my life, seems intelligent solution to some of these problems.
Yeah. And I think people can deal with ranges around things and uncertainty around things. We know this from a number of anecdotes, again, from, for example, travel times. People can deal with a range around travel times. I'm even thinking about all these fancy washer dryers, for instance. You have a lookup table for the kind of things you can do with the washer dryers. At first glance, you'd think people would be daunted by that, but no, they just start using it and they get used to it. Of course, with a washer dryer, you're not concerned about being stranded in the middle of nowhere, but I think the technology is not something they can't deal with. It's the uncertainty, and how will I understand that uncertainty, and the lack of exposure, I think.
I think we'd be remiss to leave off talking about individual ownership of electric cars without talking about charging. You touched on it at the start. As far as my understanding goes, there's 3 different types of charger. There's a unmanaged plug, basically, where you just plug your car in and it charges. It just begins charging and will charge until you unplug it. There's a smart charger, which has some sort of smart control, so you charge at some points and don't charge at others. And then there's this vehicle-to-grid charger. Could you maybe just go through... could you maybe explain what a vehicle-to-grid charger is, and how it might be used how it or a smart charger might be used intelligently, and what's the incentives in doing that?
So, as you rightly said, there's, broadly speaking, I guess, there's obviously some technological differences in the types of charge points, connector types, and so on. But broadly speaking, I think for most consumers, the difference is slow chargers, fast chargers, and rapid chargers, if you will. Now, the difference with smart charging or vehicle-to-grid charging is that the charging unit is not just fast, is not just that it can be fast, but that it can be flexibly instructed, so to speak, and it can go both ways. Now, a smart charger is not necessarily a vehicle-to-grid charger. So a vehicle-to-grid charger is one that can go both ways. The electricity is both drawn down as well as can be put back into the grid. So if there is a time when a part of the electricity grid is in need of some additional power because there is an excess demand in a particular part of the grid, and these kind of things can become overloading the grid can become a real part of the future if all vehicles are electric, for instance. So then being able to put some of the electricity from your car, which is effectively a big battery now, back back into the grid would be a vehicle-to-grid service. And it's not just about covering the electricity grid when there's extra demand, but it's also about a future of potential renewables. So if you had power generated heavily based on renewables, and if renewables and they do have an uncertainty, will the wind blow at this particular time? Will it be sunny or cloudy at a particular time? Then the battery capacity of all these cars can actually help to cover that uncertainty, that or to ensure that the renewables-based grid can actually operate reliably, basically. So that's a two-way charger, effectively, is a vehicle-to-grid charger. Whereas a smart charger, and there's no reason why a vehicle-to-grid charger can't be smart or a smart charger can't be a vehicle-to-grid charger. But a smart charger, the idea of a smart charger is that you can actually remotely instruct it to do a number of different things. So, for instance, if somebody could plug in their car at night and then tell the smart charger, I want it to be fully charged by 8 in the morning, then there is enough time, let's say, for that charger to more than fill itself. If it filled itself quickly, the battery. If the battery filled itself at normal speed, whatever speed charger you had at home, it would maybe take 4 hours. And let's say from the point when you plug in to the point when it's available, let's say you have 9 hours, then the charger could actually draw down electricity and put it back in the grid, as the case may be, if it does have two-way connection, smartly, so that you get the best price out of the electricity, for instance. One reason you might want to do that is so that you get the best electricity prices, for instance. Another reason you might want to do that is from a grid perspective. If all vehicles had that kind of flexibility in terms of when they need to be charged by, it's easier as a system to manage how all these vehicles are charged and ready for when they're needed without, in any sense, overloading different parts of the grid. So it's about managing demand efficiently by providing some of that information and having a charger that can handle that kind of instructions effectively.
I absolutely love this as a potential solution to some of the major problems that come with renewables. The core idea, from what I've understood, is that if you have low demand but lots of wind, say you just charge the batteries, and then when your wind drops and your demand goes up, you can discharge them. I mean, there's lots of other reasons, but that's kind of that's a simple way of thinking about it. I think what I like most about that is obviously that helps the power system to decarbonize, but it actually also helps the transport system, because it means that people are getting their electricity to charge their cars cheaper, and they might actually have a slight earning because they're offering a service to the power system. So it's just a huge synergy, and it's those sort of things that are really good for sort of this holistic decarbonisation we're aiming for.
Absolutely.
I think what's interesting is that we've talked about EVs as being touted as the most promising decarbonisation tool for road transport, or certainly private road transport. And that's in large part because they're most similar to internal combustion cars and the individual ownership we have at the moment. And then actually all the anxiety and hesitancy, the problems, comes from their slight differences to internal combustion engines. But if we're really thinking boldly and innovatively about the future, don't we have to move past this idea of individual car ownership? We're not going to be able to get to a zero carbon world where everything's exactly the same but zero carbon. And I think one of the main technologies you talked about to do that with these shared cars, how might that change the way we get around the world, and what are the implications for energy system and decarbonisation in general?
So the idea here is that a fleet of vehicles that provides the private vehicle needs, or the car driving needs, if you will, of a population is more effective than every person individually owning their vehicle. And I think the commonly cited statistic, which I can't remember off the top of my head now, is that every vehicle that is privately owned, on average, sits in the driveway for so many hours in a week and is used only so many hours. And there's a standard, I can't quite remember the numbers right now, but the bottom line is that most people own a vehicle as an option. The value of the vehicle is an option value. They're not using it all the time. And in order to maximize the efficiency of vehicle use, if that vehicle were available to other people as well, so that you have a common resource, and then all you're doing as an individual is just finding the nearest shared car that's available at the moment when you need it, and you pick it up and you drive off, or the nearest, whether you want to drive off or have somebody drive you, is the primary difference, I think, between a shared car and ride hailing. And who knows, in a future where if autonomous vehicles were more prominent, maybe there's going to be no difference between a shared car and ride hailing, because all vehicles are autonomously getting themselves around and making themselves available. That's quite possible. But the bottom line is that having such a set of shared cars for private use of individuals means that you're maximizing the efficiency of this fleet of cars that are servicing the same population. But there's also other advantages. You don't have to worry about space for all these additional cars that are parked all over the place. You don't have to worry about, depending on the service that is being provided, of course, you don't have to worry about insurance and a lot of other things that are managed sort of centrally. And you are effectively, it is a version of mobility as a service. You are paying for the service, and you do get your own private car when you need it, but it's part of a shared resource, which is the idea, I think, of shared cars effectively.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing idea, thinking of a city without any parked cars. Like, you'd just be so much more space.
Absolutely. And it's working out quite well in some, it's much easier to demonstrate, I think, in smaller and medium-sized cities what would happen much more quickly, because you're replacing a smaller set of private vehicles with a fleet. And there are cities like Bremen. We had a really interesting conversation with Bremen last year. And in Bremen, because it's a smaller sized city, and because the planning authorities are very proactive, they actually have taken it into their hands to push shared cars out, basically make them available. They're privately, the service is outsourced, but Bremen, the city, takes active part in the way the thing is run, the service is run, basically. And it's made a huge difference from what I can tell. So yes, exactly. Imagine a future when all cars are somewhere out there, not one per person who needs it, a smaller percentage because it's more efficient and will still provide everyone's needs if needed. And all you do is you look it up on your phone, you know where your nearest electric, autonomous shared car is. If it's autonomous, maybe it even comes to your door and you're off. But worst case, you're walking up to the nearest corner of the road and you're picking up the car and you're off. And if there's sufficient charging infrastructure, it's also charged and you're not worried about where and when it's going to be charged.
There's some really interesting questions around equity and fairness here, I think, because I think there's sort of two major things that pop up to me in this conversation. If we replaced all Uber drivers in London with autonomous cars, then we suddenly have tens of thousands of people unemployed. Is that fair? And the second thing is a slightly more positive note, which I think if we could get ride sharing to be truly ubiquitous, I think that really presents some mobility impaired people with a lot of freedom. So I think the most obvious one is elder people. Some of them really hold on to their license for dear life and probably drive a little bit past when it's safe for them to do so. But that's because once they stop driving, they become isolated, and maybe in a future where they didn't have to actually drive the car to be going somewhere in it, their horizons open up again. I don't know if you want to comment on any of these sort of fairness issues.
The fairness issue is a tricky one. On the one hand, I think we want mobility to be provided as efficiently and as equitably as possible. And things like ride-hailing, whether it's autonomous or whether it's driven by an actual driver, do provide a lot more freedom to a lot more people, I think. Arguably, does it provide equally fair mobility to low-income older people versus higher-income older people? These are all questions we should still be asking. And this is the reason why we have planning authorities. TfL has been, in fact, just before the pandemic hit, TfL was trialing out quite a few on-demand transit services, which is effectively like ride-hailing, like shared ride-hailing, but slightly larger. So you have mini vans or mini buses instead of smaller cars. And so you'd have 10 people instead of 3 or 4 people, and it makes it more affordable to a lot of people, and still is close to a door-to-door service effectively. So I think that on the one hand, there is that equity, that or equitability of transport service that the emerging mobility services are starting to fill, and there's a lot more work to be done to ensure that we achieve that equitability, but it's heading in that direction, and that's definitely a good thing. You asked a slightly different question about, is it fair to drivers if all of these vehicles were autonomous? And I think that's a very controversial question. So I don't want to get myself into trouble in a sense, but I think that if you ask me personally, I think that is it unfair to get rid of jobs that are not necessarily the best for the drivers in the first place, so that as long as they are sufficiently retrained or reskilled to something that's actually better for them? So in other words, do we want to necessarily have a world where people have this difficult job of driving others under potentially stressful conditions and doing it all day long? It can certainly not be very good for their health in any sense. So if a machine is actually the better thing to do that job, then I don't necessarily think it's unfair to sort of eliminate that job category. But I think it's unfair if you eliminate the job category and then don't give these people an opportunity to be reskilling themselves and finding something else that they can equally well do.
I think what you're talking about for me brings to mind coal mining in the US, where there's clearly better alternatives, but people have entrenched saying we're going to keep these coal jobs, and actually it just ends up worse for everyone.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think this idea of you can't keep jobs that are extremely inefficient, but it's a losing battle. But you need to sort of make sure the outcome for the driver is better. So one technology that I get very excited by is micromobility, and I think that's quite nicely related to these ride-sharing apps. So recently in London, they made electric scooters legal, and I believe they've been the sort of bane of European cities for a couple of years now. Personally, I find them quite exciting, and I think if you're talking about efficiency, moving around in a 20-kilo scooter from an energy point of view is a lot more efficient than moving around in a 2-ton car. No pollution, less traffic, things like that. I think they're really exciting. What's your opinion on micromobility? Is that a city filled with scooters and electric bikes? Does that excite you?
Personally, yes. Personally, I think it's really interesting to imagine a future where the bike effectively, in some form, I think of the e-scooter as a bike for people who don't like to bike. But I think effectively a future where these kind of bikes and e-scooters help people get around autonomously longer distances than they would otherwise with a bike or a kick scooter. So, and the reason I say this is because I have a kick scooter and I still use it, and I haven't actually gotten an e-scooter yet. And the main reason for that is because I can use the kick scooter on the sidewalks, and I'm not very comfortable riding a bike or an electric scooter on a road with cars and other motorized vehicles, basically. And it's as simple as that. I have the same discomfort with e-scooters on roads that I had with bikes when I was riding on roads. I will ride off track anywhere, and I've had accidents off road as well, but I'm petrified of driving amongst motorized vehicles. Keeping that in mind, I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm sure there are a lot of people who are not sort of avid bicyclists, but who like to cycle, who won't do it because they don't like bicycling alongside a motorized vehicle. Now, the e-scooter, given that I use a kick scooter, I might feel that the e-scooter is just a little more stable if I'm not an avid bicycler. It feels a little more comfortable. I can step off if something's going wrong. But personally, perhaps knowing what I do of transport systems, I'm equally scared of them as I am of bikes to some extent. And so I think though that's not a problem of the mode itself. I think that personally, micromobilities theoretically, conceptually have a great potential because especially electric micromobility services have great potential because that same bike can get me further than if I were bicycling on my own power, which means I would consider it for longer distances than I would otherwise, which means I could replace a call to Uber with an electric bike because it gets me further than I would have if I had walked or biked or even used my kick scooter. So I think the potential is huge, and most of us make trips that are less than 1 or 2 miles long, which can be easily replaced with a sort of some form of micromobility, especially if it's an electric micromobility service. The problem, I think, is in there being sufficient numbers and the right of way, in a sense. So if I was surrounded by people who are also on their e-bikes and micromobilities, and if we had, not just surrounded by them, but surrounded by them in a way that there are rules about how we use them, the same way that cars have lanes and so on, I would happily use it. To begin with, I think making sure that I'm separated from the motorized vehicle so that I'm comfortable using it, but also that I'm surrounded by people knowing that I'm not going to suddenly get cut off by somebody or knocked over by another e-bike user because he or she is going much faster than they should be or sort of veering off lane and so on, because there's a lack of appropriate regulation rules. There's not enough of these around. I find it harder to step on to that sort of path, and I'm guessing a lot of people do as well. So it's another one of those situations where we're at the cusp of something, and it could be potentially very valuable, but we need to make the conditions suitable for users to be able to adopt it and adopt it comfortably so that it is a sustainable solution.
I think it's pretty exciting, and I share your dislike of being out of breath while cycling. How do you put it? Cyclists who don't like cycling. I'm inflicted with a cycling commute, and I resent every time I have to breathe heavily on it. So I think an electric bike would be a good alternative. I think we'd be remiss to end this conversation without briefly talking about some of the impacts of COVID. I'm sure it's had profound implications on transport. I would be interested to hear from an expert, briefly as you like. What interesting things have we learned about our transport habits during COVID? Do you think it's brought about any fundamental or lasting changes?
I think there's no doubt that there'll be some lasting changes. In fact, one of the most immediate thing I can think about, and this is less about transport directly, but indirectly it's very much about transport. I think the fact that people have become much more aware that they can do things virtually more efficiently than they thought they could. So it's basically accelerated the virtual versus physical world, the virtual world entering the physical world. There were always people who worked from home on and off. Some wanted to work more, but their employers perhaps didn't let them. Others had plenty of opportunity, but did sometimes, not all the time. And those who worked from home all times were thought of as sort of a specialist breed almost. And I think what the pandemic's done is it's made everyone realize that, in fact, we can all work from home if we wanted to. We might not want to do it 5 days a week, but we can, and we do like some of the aspects of working from home. And so the entrance of the virtual world into the physical has been accelerated, I think, by the pandemic, which then has lots of implications. Simple example. I personally am more comfortable now with living in a home that is not necessarily right next to a tube station, because I'm thinking that in the long term, since I work in a place that will let me, I would prefer to go into work 3 days a week rather than 2 days a week on a consistent basis, which then means that if I'm not right next to a tube station, then I'm going to start thinking about what does this mean for my travel more generally, because the commute and the solution that I choose for the commute will affect other travel decisions I make. And so I happen to have a car because I have 2 kids, and having 2 kids doesn't make it easy to get on the tube network and the buses. But if I move away and I have a car, does that mean I'll end up using the car more? This is probably a valid case for a lot of people. But personally, given that I live in London and I don't like driving in London, if I'm not close to a tube station, I'm going to start looking at those micromobility services a lot more. Can I use one of those to get to the tube station as quickly as I would have when I lived 5 minutes away from it? So some of these first and last mile solutions that people have been talking about for a long time become more and more critical as sort of the effects of the pandemic start to make themselves known. And thankfully, we're also, from a transport perspective, on the cusp of a revolution, have been on the cusp of a revolution of all of these mobility services and micromobilities that can make this transition happen more effectively. So there's more of an incentive for people to change behavior. At the same time, the technologies are sort of coming into the picture.
Yeah, it's I guess it's a bit like a sort of big war or something. It's pushing forwards innovation and behavior change and things like that in many ways. Great, Aruna, that was a fantastic conversation. There are in fact 2 bonus questions at the end of the podcast, which I'm going to ask you now. So, if you could click your fingers and bring to maturity any technology that is currently in development or even concept stage that you think would most speed up decarbonisation, which one would you choose and why?
Can I go completely blue skies and say teleportation? Because I prefer that. I wouldn't want to travel.
I don't think I guess that's in concept stage. But yeah, I guess, but then you'd be out of a job.
Yeah. Well, not me personally, because the kind of thing I do applies anyways. I'm about consumer behavior really, so I think I can adapt quite easily.
All right. I love that. All right. Yeah, nice. Fair enough. The second and final question is, so greenhouse gas emissions are leading not only to a climate disaster, but also an ecological disaster, leading to widespread extinctions. If you could de-extinct any animal that's currently extinct, and this doesn't have been made extinct because of climate change, and you don't even have to have a very charitable reason for bringing it back just because you think it's cool, which animal would you choose to de-extinct?
Wrong question, Cormac. I'm a huge fan of wildlife and animals, so I wouldn't be able to pick. I'd want to bring them all back, regardless of how scary and dangerous they are. I can't pick. I mean, if I were talking to my kids, I'd say the dodo because they love the how the dodo is animated. But I mean, that's only because I'm talking to my kids so much these days. Genuinely, I really couldn't pick. I would feel like I was being unfair. It's their world just as much as it is ours, and I think that for whatever reasons, a number of those reasons have been our fault very much. They don't exist, and I feel very strongly about each and every one of them. So I genuinely couldn't pick.
Yeah, so equitable transitions and equitable de-extinctions.
Please, yes. If we could do that, I would do it. Yeah.
All right, well, great. Listen, Aruna, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate you coming on.
You're welcome. Thank you. It was fun.
Thanks for listening to Low Carbon Conversations, a podcast from the IDLES programme at Imperial College London. If you'd like to get in touch, email us at idles@imperial.ac.uk. For more information about energy research at the college, or to learn about our internationally unique Master's programme in Sustainable Energy Futures, visit imperial.ac.uk/Energy Futures Lab.
This was the final episode of our first series of Low Carbon Conversations. I really hope you enjoyed it and learned some new things. If you did, please help spread the word about the show. Tell your friends about it and share it on social media. There are 5 episodes in total, so if you haven't listened to them all, you should go back and check them out. If you have any feedback or ideas for new episodes, get in touch via email at idles@imperial.ac.uk. I'm your host, Cormac O'Malley. See you back here for Series 2.